Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. Before we begin this episode, I want to alert you that my latest book is now available in both print and ebook formats. The title is Love American Style, and it is a collection of short stories about men, women, their passions, and their dysfunctions. There's a short link in the episode notes that will take you to my Amazon profile page, where all 4 of my books are listed, 3 novels in this new short story collection. Again, the title of the new one is Love American Style, named after the TV series that ran from 1969 until 1974. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is the late novelist Joseph Heller of Catch-22 fame, and one of his biographers, Tracy Daugherty, who is himself the author of 6 novels, a novella collection, a short story, or rather 6 short story collections, a book of personal essays, and a collection of essays on literature and writing. Now, in addition to that, he has published biographies on several authors, including Donald Barthelme, Larry McMurtry, Joan Didion, Billy Lee Brammer, etc. His most recent bio, literary bio or author bio, was Larry McMurtry, and he appeared with me, meaning Tracy Daugherty, joined me on episode number 134 of the Novelist of this podcast, and a great discussion, really interesting career that Larry McMurtry lived, and Tracy, captured it big time. So again, that's episode number 134. I invite you to listen, but not until we talk about Joseph Heller. Tracy Daugherty, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Mike. It's great.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time. Give us, for starters, an overview of, I've got kind of the bio on Joseph Heller, but if you were to kind of go through your dust-covered notes on your bio, how would you summarize Joseph Heller? We all know he wrote Catch-22, but can you kind of give us Joseph Heller in a nut?
The funny thing about Heller is that he really is mostly only known for Catch-22, but he did write several other novels, and I think the other novels are quite good, each very different, each in their own way. But it is Catch-22 that we think of when we think of Joseph Heller, so he is kind of thought of as a one novel novelist. And the reason being that Catch-22 so captured its moment in history. And there are some ironies about that, which we can get into. But that book just captured its time so well when it came out in the 1960s. And in many ways, he couldn't get past it. It was such a success that he couldn't top it. And I think that was both the challenge and the frustration of his later career. But in other ways, Heller was very much a man who absorbed his time, and that being, the 50s and the 60s, and then the later 70s and 80s. And in many ways, his books, if you look at all of them beyond just Catch-22, you'll see, a great deal of the evolution of American culture in the very last half of the 20th century.
So it was 1961 that Catch-22 was published. Ever since, Catch-22 has been a catchphrase, or a phrase used by people,
Yes.
a Catch-22 situation. There was really no way out of it. And it was a satire about capitalism and military bureaucracy. What other book in history has become such a popular catchphrase for people? Are there any others that come to mind, Tracy?
Not in the same way. We can look back at American literary history, and you can look at books like, say, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out and then changed American culture by putting a spotlight on slavery. And we can look at Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, about the meatpacking industry and the terrible conditions in food factories, which caused the U.S. Congress to pass laws about safety in factory life. So some books like that have had a major effect on American culture, but very few books have added to our language. And so, as you say, the phrase Catch-22 became, a part of our everyday language and remains part of our everyday language. It's a very useful phrase. In fact, it's probably more apropos now than it ever was, given, the misinformation and the disuse of language in our public speech. So yeah, he really continues to have an effect. I see the phrase catch-22 in news articles almost every day.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. But interestingly, my understanding is the original title was not Catch-22. What was it?
It was not. When he first conceived the story, he was calling it Catch-18. And I suppose we should backtrack a little bit and talk about what the phrase even means. In shorthand, it's when you say the opposite of what you really mean. And in the novel Catch-22, the crux of the matter is that Yossarian, a soldier in the Second World War, is flying bombing missions over Europe, and he wants to get out of it because it's very dangerous, and he doesn't want to die. And so he's told that it's a very sane reaction to want to stop flying. But if you're sane, you have to continue to fly your missions. If you're insane, you don't have to fly them. But if you claim that you don't want to fly them because they're dangerous, then you're clearly sane. So you have to fly them. So it's a circular form of reasoning, and you can't get out of it. And it's a perfect metaphor for any kind of bureaucracy. We all recognize it, no matter what kind of job we're doing. We know the insanity of red tape and bureaucracy, and that's what Catch-22 is. Originally, he called it Catch-18, and this was just a phrase he made up. He didn't make up the bureaucracy. He experienced it firsthand in the military. So he's talking about a real phenomenon. But the phrase Catch-18 was just something he made up. It was a random number he chose. And then when the book was about to be published, his publisher realized there was another book about to come out by a writer named Leon Uris. And that book was called Mila 18. And it was about concentration camps during the Second World War. And so Robert Gottlieb, who was Heller's editor at the time, said, well, we can't have two novels out at the same time that have the number 18 in the title. We've got to change the number. So they scrambled. And for months and months, Heller and his editor and his agent kept trying to think up a different number. And they kept thinking, what is a funny number? And, that's just strange in itself, trying to intrinsically find a number that's funny. They came up with 22. There are different stories about why they settled on 22. It was the birthday of his agent. That's one thing. So she claims that she came up with it. Gottlieb dreamed about it one night. Just the number came to him in a dream, and so he claims it. So who knows where it finally came from? It's meaningless, really.
Yeah, but it has a better it's more euphony than Catch-18, I think.
It does, yeah. I think it was a lucky thing for Heller that they had to change the number.
Yeah, I agree. So what's interesting is here's Robert Gottlieb, all-star editor, the late great. I mean, he only died a few years ago. The great editor, working with Joseph Heller. He knew he had a real talent on his hands. But when the book published, there were critics who said, look, you could pull 100 pages out of that thing and it would read just fine. And the author wouldn't even know those 100 pages were taken out. And I believe, now check me on this, Tracy, but I believe Heller took the challenge and he was able to say, right here, this is where you pulled the pages out.
Yes, it's true. It's true. And in fact, the original drafts of Catch-22 are even more voluminous than the final version of the novel. I mean, he wrote thousands and thousands of pages. He had thousands of note cards. He would write scenes and fragments of dialogue on note cards and stick them up all over his office and as well as his home studio. He worked on this book for many, many years, beginning in the late 1950s, and just had voluminous pages. So Robert Gottlieb, I think, is a real hero of this story. He was an amazing young editor at the time at Simon and Schuster. And he initially had some doubts about the book. Norman Mailer had come out with The Naked and the Dead, which at the time in the 50s was kind of the World War II novel. People thought, Mailer captured that war and nobody's going to be able to top this. And so in many ways, by the time Heller was working on this book, people thought, well, World War II novels are done with. It's not a subject people want to hear about anymore. So that was one problem. And the other problem was, how do you write a funny story about war? People, were uncomfortable with that idea. And Gottlieb thought, maybe we shouldn't try to talk about war in humorous ways. This could be a problem. But the writing was so good and so funny that he finally said, all right, I love this book. Let's do it. And he really sat down with Heller face to face in Gottlieb's office. And they would just have marathon editing sessions where they would throw out pages and reshuffle pages. It was an incredible job. They would tape up pages on the walls and scribble over them. And the other editors at Simon & Schuster would pass by in the hallways and look in at what was going on. It was like a hurricane of paper. And the two of them just madly, reshuffling this book. So to Heller's credit, as well as Gottlieb's, they were both willing to compromise and do whatever they could to make the book better. And you're right, a lot of critics still felt it was baggy and overlong. But, that's the way Heller had to work. It was just his energy, his enthusiasm, his kind of humor. It just required this kind of voluminous enthusiasm.
Yeah, and the reason I bring up Gottlieb is that here he is, a famed editor, probably the last guy who would say, "Hey, we're going to go ahead and publish this thing with 100 pages that are unnecessary." He obviously saw that there was something to it, and it captured the American imagination in a big way. What was it though about the book that made it that readers embraced so hardly?
What's interesting about it, and this is one of the ironies I was referring to earlier, is that this is a book about World War II. It's very clearly set in World War II. It's based on Heller's own experience, much of it. But when it came out in 1961, it seemed to be more about the Vietnam War. And that didn't happen immediately, of course, because 61 is a little early. The Vietnam War really didn't heat up and become, a public matter of debate until later in the 60s. But almost immediately, the humor and the satire on bureaucracy struck a chord that seemed, very of the moment. So it did not seem like a historical novel. It did not seem like a World War II novel to readers who came to it. And then when it came out in paperback, that's when it really took off. Initially it didn't sell terribly well in hardback. But then mass market paperback and the marketing effort that Simon & Schuster put into the book to keep it alive for many years really pushed it over the top. And by the time it was out in paper in the mid-60s, people on college campuses were embracing it as a Vietnam book. It seemed to be talking about the madness of that war. And, people would have posters of the cover in their dorm rooms. I mean, and people would have buttons there. Yossarian lives. Yossarian is the name of the main character in the book. And so, college students are walking around with Yossarian lives on their lapels and their T-shirts, which was a kind of protest against the Vietnam War. So it was really taken up as a cult book in that sense.
Yeah, amazing. 10 million plus copies sold. I don't know how many today, but millions of copies. 10, as they say, 10 million plus. Now, John Yossarian, who is the man caught in the Catch-22, trying to get out. Look, I don't want to fly anymore, I'm afraid. Well, but that means you're not insane, as you were explaining. Now, he was apparently the inspiration for Klinger on MASH. Is that right? Who would wear a dress to try to communicate that he was nuts and wasn't behaving properly and wanted to get out of the military. They called it a section something or other.
I don't know that for sure, but it seems MASH seems very much taken from Catch-22. We'd have to talk to the writers and producers of MASH to confirm that, but I can't look at it without believing that they were heavily influenced by Heller's book.
Yeah. Yeah. So why Joseph Heller? You wrote a biography. You've written biographies about great writers. On the one hand, it's why, of course, Joseph Heller was a great novelist, but there's lots of people you could have written about. What really motivated you to go and research and write about Heller?
I have always thought of biographies as a form of cultural history. I'm interested in writing about individuals, but I'm also interested in writing about what was going on in the culture at the time they wrote their books, what influenced them to write the way they wrote. And Catch-22 being such an iconic book of the time was just a natural choice for me. I remember reading it as a young kid. I was in my early teens, I think, when I came across it in the late 60s. And it had a huge effect on me because I didn't know anything about World War II, but I read the book, as we were just discussing, as though it were about, the current events. And its humor immediately struck me as that, yeah, this is the absurdity of government, the absurdity of war. This is the absurdity I see on TV every night. This is absolutely capturing the moment. So I was drawn to that. And I, frankly, I think I was like a lot of Heller's readers. I read Catch-22 and loved it as a young person. And then I lost track of Heller. I didn't read his other books. I didn't keep up with them. One reason being that, over 10 years elapsed after Catch-22 before his second novel came out. So he kind of dropped out of sight. And I think a lot of his readers lost track of him. And it was only later that I came back to the other books and I thought, well, these are pretty good too. And so this guy is, for all of the hoopla surrounding Catch-22, he's strangely underrated as a writer. So that's another irony of his career. So he was just a fascinating figure to me. And then we can talk about the kind of humor in his work. He really captures, I think, the brand of humor that was coming up in the 50s and 60s, and that really kind of took over popular culture. Those books are real representative of that period.
Now, did he live? I mean, he was a celebrity after Catch-22. Did he live the celebrity? How big a celebrity was he? And did he live the celebrity lifestyle, or was he much more reclusive than that?
Oh no, he was not a recluse. He was a hugely gregarious man. He had huge appetites, literally and figuratively. He just loved to go out and eat with his friends. He would hang out with people like Mel Brooks and Zero Mostel from Movie Land and other people in New York, and they would go out to Chinese lunches and long dinners. And he worked as an ad man. The TV series Mad Men is pretty representative of the life that Heller lived. And that's another series. You mentioned MASH.
Hmm.
I'm very sure that the producers of Mad Men were looking to Heller as one of their inspirations because that was the life he was living, and he wrote about it in his second novel. So he was living that life of, long martini lunches every day and hanging out with movie people at night, and loved the socializing, loved being Joseph Heller, being famous. And really for many years, he lived on the reputation of Catch-22. So he was living a pretty lavish and pretty sweet life, I would say, in terms of material success.
Yeah, so I didn't realize that about Mad Men. So the second, a series I absolutely love. The second novel then was which one?
It's called Something Happened, and it didn't come out until 1974. So, a lot of years elapsed between the first book and the second one. And when Something Happened came out in 74, one of the criticisms leveled against it was, well, Joseph Heller's new novel is called Something Happened, and it's a book in which nothing happens. Because it was about a middle-class American man who is saddled with a job he doesn't much like, and saddled with a family that wears him down. So it was not a book of, huge events and dramatic happenings. It was not about the war. It was the post-war book. It really was what happened to Heller's generation when they came back from the war. And they were materially successful and living a good life in that sense, but they weren't satisfied. They weren't fulfilled. It was kind of the malaise of, be careful. When you get what you want, it won't satisfy you as much as you think it will, because it's, there's a kind of spiritual emptiness to that life. And so it's really another long book like Catch-22, in which very wittily Heller takes apart post-war American middle class and upper class society. So it's a book about, success, but the dissatisfactions of success.
To the person who would say, after Catch-22, he really never did anything equal to that, you would say what?
I would say Something Happened is actually a much better novel. It doesn't have the impact of Catch-22. It's not as outrageously funny as Catch-22, But I think it captures its moment just as much as Catch-22 does. The problem being that the moment it captures, the mid-1970s, was a time of kind of malaise and drift in America. It was kind of, it's the world of disco, if you want to summarize it in shorthand. We went from wonderful rock and roll and protest music then to disco. And I'm insulting all the people who love disco, but that's my shorthand way of saying, the culture had kind of gone into an aimless phase where things weren't as energized as they were before, and things seemed trivial and silly, and that's the moment this book captures, and it does it beautifully and perfectly. And it's a much tighter novel structurally, even though it's not very dramatic. And it's finally a very tragic book. It's there's a I won't give it away for readers who might want to go to it, but from a book about a middle-aged man sort of complaining about his life, it ends up in a very tragic and sad way, and it's quite an indictment of American culture. So I think it's a great book.
Well, my friends and I remember when disco came along and kind of subjugated rock and roll. We hated it.
Yeah, well, yeah, my apologies to all disco lovers, but
yeah, mine too. It just was one of those sudden changes that a lot of us didn't appreciate. Now, Barbara Gelb, who is was a friend of Heller's, once described him to the New York Times Book Review like this: "For 20 years now, I have managed to overlook his frequent sulkiness, his gluttonous table manners, and his tendency to growl no before he even knows what the question is." What was your understanding of the man's personality? I mean, does that resonate with you, or what do you know about Joseph? Did you get to talk to and interview Joseph Heller? Were you researching this while he was still around?
No. I began the book after Heller had passed on, but I did talk to his daughter Erica quite a bit, and his son Ted was also very helpful to me when I was writing the book. And so, yes, I think Barbara Gelb's description certainly matches the way Erica described her father. She loved her father, but she had great difficulty with him. In fact, the daughter in the book, Something Happened, is very much based on Erica, and it's a relationship where a daughter and father clash terribly. So she felt that he could be verbally abusive. He could ignore his children and his wife, and he wound up leaving his wife, in part, I think, because of the celebrity life was so alluring to him, and he wanted more excitement. So family life didn't look as good to him. So yeah, there are many flaws in his character, in the way he treated some of the people who were intimate with him, and the way he treated his children. It's a kind of a complicated portrait of a man who was never satisfied and who was very restless and larger than life in his appetites, all of his appetites. So yeah, he could be a difficult person. But I think one of the interesting things about that is that this is a man who I think was traumatized from childhood, and then certainly traumatized in wartime. One thing that happened when he was a young child, his father died young. When he was 4 years old, his father died. So that was a trauma. And then he learned later on, a few years later, that his older brother and older sister were actually his stepbrother and sister, that his mother was their stepmother. And this is not something he had known. And they all knew it. And suddenly he felt, there had been this big family secret. They were Russian immigrants, his parents. They were first generation Russian immigrants. He grew up in Coney Island, which would probably traumatize anybody. Now I'm insulting Coney Islanders, man. I'm really on a roll today.
Yeah.
But he had all these weird traumas, and I think this is where the notion of Catch-22 sort of comes from, that what people are telling you turns out not to be true. It turns out to be the opposite. He thought his mother was his brother and sister's mother, and that wasn't true. So this notion of Catch-22 was planted early, and then he goes to war. And, the central scene in Catch-22 is, Yossarian thinks he's going to die. His plane gets hit while it's in the air, and a guy on the plane does die. And, it's a very hugely traumatic moment, and it's absolutely true. It happened to Heller. So here is a man deeply traumatized. And then he has this huge success with Catch-22 and wants to live the good life. So he's kind of living as if there's no tomorrow. And I do think it led to a lot of excessive behavior and hurtful behavior to the people around him.
Now, between being an advertising copywriter and being a sometimes absent father, and also leaving his wife, uh, it maps kind of along with Kurt Vonnegut, who was a PR guy at General Electric.
Yes, yes.
Didn't, his children said he could be tons of fun running around the yard with him and neighbor kids when he was in okay mood, but he was, often fulminating in his office trying to get the copy to work right and was having a hard time of it. And did eventually leave his wife, who, when I read his biography, his wife just seemed like just a stand-up woman who was very loyal to him, and then he ended up leaving her.
Yeah.
Did they have a friendship at all?
They
To your
did,
knowledge?
yeah, they did. I don't think they were terribly close, but they did know each other, and they did sometimes socialize. And in fact, the day Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, they were on stage together. I believe it was at Notre Dame. I'd have to check that, but I think they were giving a reading together at Notre Dame, and they got word that Martin Luther King had been assassinated while they were in front of an audience, and they sort of both reacted with horror in public. I mean, they didn't know what to say or do, but they were together in that moment, and it remained really an indelible time for both of them. They reminisced about it a lot, so they did know each other. And you're right, they had a similar kind of career in life. I think it's very interesting. Vonnegut once talked about his experience, the firebombing of Dresden, in which Slaughterhouse Five is based. And he says, I died that day. I mean, that. I remember one interview where Vonnegut says, really, that was the day I died. I never really came back to myself fully after that experience. And I think that's the same is true of Heller's experience as a bombardier in World War II, when his plane got hit and his gunner, got severely wounded, and he thought he was going to die that day. That's a moment that Heller keeps returning to over and over again in his memoirs and in his writing. One version of it after another appears in his novels. And one of the reasons Catch-22 might be so long, and why people thought it needed to be edited, is because repetition is very important to it. This is this horrible moment in your life that you can't get past, and so you keep circling back to it. And so repetition is a very important part of Catch-22's structure. It's a necessary effect of the book. And that's the way trauma is, I think. For people who suffered terrible trauma, they can't get past that moment. It keeps sucking them back in that direction. And that's the experience that's the unfunny side of Catch-22.
Yeah, great observation. Yeah, the repetition of it. Not to mention having to, the sorties, all the sorties that you have to, as a combat pilot, you're flying one mission after another, and you got to figure my luck's going to run out at some point.
Exactly. And of course,
Yeah.
that's the other running repetition in Catch-22 is that the pilots are told, if you fly 60 missions, then you'll be able to go home. You'll be done. And then they get up to 60 missions, and then they say, well, we've upped it to 70. And then they get to 70. Well, we've upped it to 80. So it's like this endless, it's never going to end. And that's the other thing that's part of the story of Catch-22.
Another trap. Yeah. Um, Now, you did say memoirs, plural. He wrote two memoirs. Why two memoirs? What did he divide his life in half? Like, was one heavily military, the other one was more authorial?
Uh, yeah, essentially, yeah, that's right. That's right. But as I say, the military experience kind of, he just couldn't get away from it. So yeah, it's like the second half of his life is still swamped by the first half.
Now, did you find the memoirs to be how important were they to writing his bio? I mean, sometimes people, when they write autobiographies or memoirs, they oftentimes people don't trust it because they leave out all the stuff they don't want to talk about. Yeah, that happens mostly with presidential memoirs, of course, but
Yeah,
not
yeah.
strictly them. Happens
No,
with rock stars too, and so on.
well, like most memoirists, you're right. Heller avoided talking about certain things. He didn't get into his personal life very much in either memoir. Uh, but I did find him to be a pretty trustworthy narrator. The one memoir, No Laughing Matter, is about his disease, and this is a disease I'd never known how to pronounce correctly, Guillain-Barré syndrome. which he came down with in the 1980s, which is a form of paralysis. Different parts of your body, including your swallowing reflex, get affected. And he was having trouble swallowing, and then he had trouble moving. And he suffered with this for quite a long time and had to go through extensive physical therapy. So that memoir is about his disease and about his overcoming that. And then the other one is called Now and Then, which does go into his childhood somewhat and his wartime experiences. So those are the two books. And he is a garrulous man, and his narration is quite garrulous. So I think he's the one thing I appreciate about Heller's writing, maybe more than anything else, is his enthusiasm. He loves, I imagine as a human being, he was a huge talker. You can just sense that from his prose, that he would love to go on and on all night long. And that's the way the books feel to me. So maybe there's some tall tales in there, and maybe he's evading certain truths, but he's pretty open and pretty voluble about things.
Interesting. So talk about his influences. What authors influenced him?
Well, he loved the humorists that often appeared in the New Yorker during his childhood. He read, he was a great reader even as a child, a precocious reader, and he would read the New Yorker. So people like S.J. Perlman, is an example of, people who were very witty, very funny. I think he was a great fan of the Marx Brothers movies. And then he spent a lot of time at a lot of the resorts, the Jewish resorts in the Catskills. A place called Grossinger's, which was a very famous resort where there would be music and dancing and comedians, and he gravitated toward the Jewish humor of these stage comedians, and this is a big part of I think his influence. Catch-22, as well as the other books, really do, to me, have the rhythms of a lot of Jewish stand-up comedy. The kind of shtick you might hear from, a stage comic like, Henny Youngman, Take My Wife, Please. There's that kind of slapstick shtick
Yeah.
that Heller has. But then the more serious comedy of the later 50s, people like Lenny Bruce, doing political
Yes.
satire.
Getting arrested on stage.
And Mort Saul and people who would, take the headlines from the daily newspapers and start riffing on it and being very satirical and pointing out the absurdity of rules and morality, and this kind of humor. And it has these comedians were working with jazz players. They would be warm-ups for jazz bands. And Lenny Bruce once famously said, "Well, the rhythm of my jokes, I'm getting it from the improvisation of the jazz players. I'm listening to their music and I'm copying their rhythms." And you can feel that in Heller's prose too. Mad Magazine starts coming up in the late 50s and takes off in the 60s. And most of the writers for Mad Magazine were Jewish and kind of channeling the rhythms of Jewish slapstick and stand-up. And that's all over Heller. So, more than a lot of writers, I think he was influenced by that popular culture of his day, which was one reason he's able to capture it so well in his novels.
What about his work ethic? When you're a celebrity and you're loving that life and you're living that life, I think of Truman Capote, who did that to a huge extent and could never really write again. Was Joseph Heller a guy who kept the work ethic up? Did he sit down every day and write and then save the good times for the evening, or did he just get off track at times?
No, I think he did get off track. I think there were periods, certainly between Catch-22 and Something Happened, where he really did lose his train, and didn't write as regularly as he had in the past. It's clear that when he was working on Catch-22 in the 50s, he was deeply, deeply absorbed in it. He would work at his work office at Time magazine. He would come home and work. He would leave cocktail parties early to go work, and people would sort of whisper, "Oh, he's working on his novel," So he was actually well known in his social circle for being dedicated to writing that novel. So a lot of work went into Catch-22, and then it became such a success. Perhaps he had the challenge of how you top Catch-22.
Hmm.
I think that may have given him a problem for a while. Like,
The
well,
sophomore jinx, right?
yeah, exactly. I'll never be able to do this again. So it's frightening. So I think that certainly played a part in it. And then the celebrity life, as you say, tempted him into just enjoying himself. And another part of his mind was saying, "Well, I've earned this. I don't need to do it again. I've earned this good life." So yeah, he drifted for a while, and I think that's one reason Something Happened took so long. But then after Something Happened came out, he published a couple of novels in pretty quick succession. His third novel, Good as Gold, came out, which was sort of about Jewish life in America. Um, and then he published another novel right after that, um, called Picture This, which is a very strange book. It's hard to even talk about this book in terms of its plot. And at that point, Robert Gottlieb kind of got off the boat because he was saying, he thought Joe Heller was the kind of writer who did need to take a lot of time between books and develop his ideas. And then suddenly he was kicking these things out. So he kind of, I don't know if it's a matter of getting his work ethic back or whether he thought, well, I'm a brand name. I can kick out these books with my name on them and they're going to sell no matter what they are. And that's the way Gottlieb kind of thought those books were like, that they were sort of exploitive in the sense that he was using his own celebrity to sell books. I think the books actually hold up pretty well. So I think Gottlieb may have been a little too hard on him in that regard.
Mm. Now Joseph Heller started his career, my understanding is he was writing short stories and also trying to write for film. And was it a short story that was where Catch-22 is hatched, a short story that he just kept building and building on, or do I have that wrong?
No, that's true. That's true. Catch-18 was a short piece originally. And it was published in the New American Library's anthology back in the 50s. The same issue where an excerpt of On the Road appears, interestingly enough. So it's the beat years. So Jack Kerouac and Joseph Heller made their debut together in this anthology. And it's a short piece, and it really is pretty much the beginning of the novel, as it turns out. It's Yossarian in the infirmary, and the doctors think he's faking it to get out of flying. And he meets the Texan, who is all wrapped up in bandages from head to foot. And it's just this insane scene about people trying to get out of flying and the bureaucracy that's involved in introducing patients into the infirmary. And so it's just that short piece, and that's what appeared first. And because the reaction to it was so strong, he just continued writing. And he did write a few other short stories around that time, none of them with the humor of Catch-22. He was trying to write some serious stories, and they don't really work as well. Clearly, humor was one of the engines that drove his best writing.
Now, you mentioned that he got gravely ill. I think he thought he was going to die. He was in Cedars-Sinai for maybe a few months
Yeah, yeah.
and getting nursed back to health. And nurse, meaning also there was his nurse he ended up marrying, I believe, after her name was Valerie something or
Valerie
other.
Humphreys, yes.
Valerie Humphreys. So that was his nurse. She marries him after he convalesces. Um, my understanding is also he had let his health insurance lapse. He got in financial trouble, and he had some author friends who pitched in to give him a hand. Mario Puzo was one of them,
Yeah, another good friend of his.
and I think Speed Vogel, who was not really an author though, but he co-authored something with Joseph, right? With Mr.
Right, yeah. This
Heller.
guy, his name was Irving Vogel. Everybody called him Speed, and he was part of this group that I mentioned earlier, the Chinese Gourmet Club. Mel Brooks and Mario Puzo was part of it, and Zero Mostel, and Speed Vogel was one of them. He was just a friend of theirs that they all knew from hanging around New York, and they would all go eat Chinese food together. And Speed Vogel was just a great storyteller, a great oral storyteller. He'd sit around at these Chinese lunches and just have them all in stitches with his funny stories. So this memoir that came out, No Laughing Matter, it's called, is actually co-authored by Heller and Speed Vogel. and Heller needed Vogel's help because he was recovering from this strange form of paralysis and trying to get his muscles back and trying to learn to physically write again. So he needed Vogel's help to do it, and so Vogel would take dictation and all sorts of other things. But he finally got co-author credit for that book.
I should mention that not only did Catch-22 become a landmark novel, sell 10 million plus copies, but Mike Nichols, the great movie director, turned it into a film in 1970. So that was another, I'm sure, major payout to Joseph Heller for his work.
Yeah, and he did do some television writing too. He wrote an episode of McHale's Navy. I don't know if you remember that old show.
I know the name, but I don't remember ever seeing an
It was
episode.
a pretty silly show.
Kind of like F Troop on the Water or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. F Troop on the Water is a good way to describe it. Yeah, and so he wrote one episode of McHale's Navy. He wrote a couple of other television things. He was actually at one point he got paid to write the screenplay for Yellow Submarine, the Beatles movie, but none of his material ever finally made it into the final version. But he did do a draft version of the Yellow Submarine. And he wrote a play, We Bombed in New Haven, which actually did bomb in New Haven. It didn't do well. And then the movie. Of course, the movie of Catch-22 really didn't fare very well with the critics, because by the time it came out in 1970, I think the whole attitude toward Vietnam had changed somewhat. And then just a few months before Catch-22 came out, Robert Altman's movie MASH came out, which was a far better film and had far more biting satire. And so, unfortunately, the movie version of Catch-22 kind of got swamped by MASH.
Yeah, what a great movie that was, and then became a great television series to boot. Now, you had mentioned earlier, Tracy, that Good as Gold is kind of about the Jewish lifestyle. Bruce Gold, the main character, is the main as a protagonist, is my understanding. In this book, it satirized Henry Kissinger. Is that correct?
Yeah, Henry Kissinger is one of the main characters of the book, or a caricature of Kissinger is one of the main characters. And this is one of the things that Robert Gottlieb kind of objected to. So Heller had published Something Happened, and it had sort of done it had gotten mixed criticism, but it was, again, Joseph Heller, and so his name was back in the news. And so Heller kicked out this book, Good as Gold, pretty quickly afterwards, very quickly for Heller. And it was very topical. It was about the politics of the time, and Henry Kissinger is a main character. And Gottlieb said, right now we all know who Henry Kissinger is, and he's an important figure. And so you can satirize him, and that's fine. But 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, will anybody really know what Henry Kissinger was about? Will anybody care? So he thought the book was too topical and too ephemeral and too silly, and was being written too quickly. And he didn't think it was very good, and he didn't think it would do well. So Robert Gottlieb kind of got off the boat at that point.
Yeah, too much of a time signature there, I guess. I see what he means.
Yeah, but it's and I think it's true. I think you can say that the Kissinger passages in that book don't have the bite now that they did at the time, because Kissinger is no longer quite the relevant figure that he was, and younger readers won't know what the importance of that was. But there are other elements of that book. This, again, the satire of bureaucracy, of Washington, D.C. bureaucracy still hits home. And then there are passages about Jewish childhood and growing up. And I think those are quite touching, actually, and those hold up well. So it's a mixed bag. And I think, to be fair, beginning with that book and then going through the rest of Heller's books from that point on, they are all kind of mixed bags. And the reasons for that are a little hard to figure out. Maybe it's, as you suggested, he was distracted by his lifestyle. It wasn't quite as disciplined as he had been earlier. Or maybe he was more ambitious than he had the chops to pull it off. because I think they're incredibly ambitious books. And that's one of the things I continue to admire about Heller, that even if the later books don't quite hold up as well as Catch-22 does, the ambition is huge. I mean, he's really swinging for the rafters. He's really trying something important. So even if they don't quite work, there's some great stuff in all of them.
I was going to ask you if you were to take his entire body of work and characterize it. Is it a body of work that you can summarize? Is there a consistency to it? Is there a thread that runs through everything?
Yeah, certainly a view of the world as absurd. The world is an absurd place, and you're going to get yourself twisted in knots if you try to make sense of it, because it can't be made sense of. That's his worldview. The concept of Catch-22 remains, I think, central to all of them, even though he doesn't keep, bringing the phrase up. But the whole idea that what you are told is one thing is in fact something else altogether. And I think it goes back right to that childhood trauma, of not knowing who his own family really was. That was a frightening thing as a kid to learn that what you thought was your family is not in fact the case. And I think that solidified his worldview, and it's in all of the books. Humor and satire and irony are the dominant tones of all of the books. But there is an increasing melancholy. As he got older and aware of his mortality, that awareness creeps into the books. And he actually wound up writing a sequel to Catch-22 late in life. It's called Closing Time. And this was another book that Robert Gottlieb warned him against, saying, do not mess with Catch-22. That is such an iconic book. It's a beloved book. Readers love it. If you write a sequel that's not any good, it's going to spoil that book for them. Don't do it. But he went ahead and he did it. And it's, again, I think a mixed bag. But what's really interesting about it is Yossarian reappears. But this time, the book is kind of split between an imaginary world and the real world. So there are passages in Closing Time that focus on real veterans of World War II, people that Heller knew, and characters that are based on him clearly. And they're getting old, and their bodies are betraying them, and they're going to die soon, and they know it. And it's very melancholy, but also very, very moving. A portrait of getting old and feeling your frailty, and how the World War II generation is going to soon die out. And meanwhile, in the alternate world, Yossarian and the imaginary characters from Catch-22 are going to live forever because they're fictional. They're not going to die. So it's this strange mix, and it doesn't work at all for some readers. Like, you can't really try to put these two worlds together in the same book. They don't really mesh. But it's, again, the ambition of that, of our imagination and our memory, and how the imagination sort of mixes up with memory, remembering the war versus the reality of human beings who get old and die. It's really an interesting attempt to talk about what happens to a generation.
Yeah, yeah. And I laugh because I'm on Robert Gottlieb's side. I would tend to think in terms of don't spoil it. You got
Yeah,
something precious, don't spoil it, don't water it down in any sense. But writers do what motivates them. You've got to. It's not like you can just write anything. I mean, maybe some people can. Maybe John Updike could have back in the day, or Philip
and
Roth.
that's finally what Gottlieb said. He said, I don't want him to write this book. I worry about what it will do to him. But a writer has to write what he has to write. So God bless him. Let him go. That's
Yeah, and the sadness you're talking about, the kind of the tone, the change in tone as a author ages. I saw that with or felt that with Philip Roth as well, as
Oh
his
yeah.
later in his career as stuff. Fantastic stuff he wrote late in his career. In his 80s, he was writing some of his best stuff. And but there was that element, and on top of it, he was always an atheist,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
made the end maybe even more somber. That it was just oblivion
Yeah.
waiting. So
In
yeah,
one way you could look at it and say, well, it's very predictable. As a writer gets older, they're going to write about mortality, and how predictable is that? But on the other hand, I really value that. I mean, if a person is fortunate enough to live into late years and to have the health to keep writing, then we all need those reports. We need those dispatches from
I,
the people who are going ahead of us about what it's like.
I
And so
agree.
I
I
value
agree.
it.
100%. It was Roth who said, getting old uh, is a massacre. I
Oh
believe
yeah,
it's
that's a great, yeah.
yeah. Well, and I think he fell apart really fast. I mean, that he had heart issues and all that.
Yeah.
But speaking of heart issues, that's what took Joseph Heller. He was 76 years old, died of a heart attack. Sounds like he lived that he lived a aggressive life in terms of getting out there, having fun, the food and the drink.
Yeah.
But was this, do you think maybe it came down to that, or was near death with that disease he had? So I don't know how much that took out of him also.
Yeah, I think, and he was another, again, like the books and like his entire life, really. I think he went through periods of discipline where he would exercise. He would get a little overweight, and then he would get worried about that, and then he would work hard to take the weight off. So he kind of went up and down all his life like that. I think he was back and forth between being again, a man with huge appetites, a gluttonous eater, and a lover of wine and drink, and he really lived large. And then he would pull back and try to get in shape and try to write and try to be disciplined. So that was kind of a roller coaster all his life. And toward the end of his life, yeah, I think after the disease in the 80s, the paralysis, he was never quite as vigorous ever again. Yeah, I think his habits got the better of him. Um,
Mm.
and he died, yeah, after eating one night. And his children, I know Erica felt she wasn't there with him when it happened, and felt a little ambivalence about, maybe that people weren't around him to take care of him the way they should have. She felt a little bad about that, I think.
Mm. You know, I had read Avid Reader by Robert Gottlieb, his memoir, looking back over his career, and Catch-22, it plays as big a role in that book in his memoir as any other novel. And he
Yeah.
talked about there was a sadness about it at one point, and I say sadness because I listened to the audio edition, and it was Robert Gottlieb reading it, and he talked about all the work that you do in your career. And he says, even a great novel like Catch-22, will it be remembered in 50 years? There's so much coming to market these days. And I think also he just saw the massive influx of so many other things like social media and so many distractions, streaming channels and all this, and wondering whether Catch-22 would endure. Certainly the metaphor is universal. It's a universal metaphor, Catch-22. That's going to survive. But I suppose by doing that, where did that come from? Well, it came from the novel. And what did it mean? I mean,
Yeah.
in that way, it's always going to be kept alive just because that phrase is not something likely to go away.
Yeah, but I do think you raise a fascinating point. And among the things that dates quickly is humor. From one generation to another. And it's not just the substance of jokes and the point of humor, but I think it's the rhythm. Going back to that notion that a comedian like Lenny Bruce wanted to pick up jazz rhythms because that was kind of the rhythm of the moment. Catch-22 has a certain rhythm, and as you mentioned early on in our conversation, a lot of people thought it was way too long, even when it came out. And now I certainly think in this day and age, when our attention spans have been whittled down by screen time and instant Twitter stuff and things like that, our capacity for delving into something that's long and absorbing is not what it once was. And I think probably younger readers picking up Catch-22 for the first time might not find it as funny as my generation did, simply because the rhythm of it is different. It's too long and ponderous, probably, for the current attention span. That's my gut feeling, my guess. So
Yeah.
I too worry that it might not have it as long a legacy as we think. And I don't think that's just Joseph Heller. I think it's true of all work. It's something every writer has to worry about.
Yeah, yeah, good point. And at the time, he had something called the Heller cult. young people addicted to his black humor. That black
Yeah.
humor at the time, or dark humor, was you had alluded to kids on college campuses wearing, the button, Syrian lives, and reading
Hmm.
Catch-22, getting their copies and reading it and really finding it to be appealing,
Yeah.
the kind of that dark humor.
On the other hand, it's true that right now, political satire is still very much a part of our culture. A lot of people are getting their news from John Oliver and The Daily Show, and it's, that kind of satire is still very important and useful. So I think the spirit of Catch-22 is still very much with us, but the form of it, may have dated somewhat. I don't know. It would be interesting to see how young people would react to it. Now, I quit teaching a few years ago. I used to teach, American literature all the time, and but I don't have any students to test it on any longer, so I don't know.
Let me go ahead and give Joseph Heller a chance to say something here. Obviously, he's got all those novels out there and has said plenty, but I think this is from his New York Times obituary when he said, "In all my novels, there's a concern with the way people use and misuse language to obscure and confuse and build barriers, the way that words are corrupted, or the way words contradict themselves." Which immediately makes me think of George Carlin, who
Yeah,
who is just huge on that. My favorite comedian because he made you think and laugh at the
yeah,
same
yeah.
time. But yeah, so that's his own self-assessment right there. So yeah, Catch-22, long may it live. Um, Before we close up here, you had two books published this year, Tracy. You've got one was a novel titled Tales from the Bayou City, and you have another book titled We Shook Up the World: The Spiritual Rebellion of Muhammad Ali and George Harrison. Let's talk. So let's start with the second one. We Shook Up the World, Spiritual Rebellion, Muhammad Ali, George Harrison, two very different people. Talk about that one and what it's all about.
Well, there again, I'm trying to explain the 60s to myself, I think. I grew up in that time period and was so influenced by world events and by the popular culture of that time. And of course, in the 60s, nobody was bigger than the Beatles and Muhammad Ali. So I was looking back and trying to figure out why did I feel the way I felt about certain things back then, which I was too young to really understand them, but I was absorbing them through these cultural figures. So it's like I was saying earlier, I think of biography as a form of cultural history. I'm trying to figure out how we are all shaped by the world we're in. So I looked at Muhammad Ali and George Harrison, and
Why
they're
George Harrison out of
well,
the Fab Four?
yeah, everybody thinks that John Lennon was more similar to Ali than Harrison because he was, a brash, loudmouth the way Ali was, and Harrison was a pretty quiet fellow in comparison. But it's really their religious journey that seemed to me to be the bond between them. Ali, latched onto a form of Islam that was exotic to most Americans. Harrison latched onto a form of Hinduism that was exotic to most Americans. And I think both of those were linked to what was going on at the time. Certainly, Ali's version of Islam cannot be separated from the civil rights struggles of the time and the colonialism of the world, which was breaking apart. All these countries in Africa and Asia were going through all sorts of tumult because the colonial yoke was being lifted from them, but then they had no sort of social organization. Same thing with Harrison. What was happening in Vietnam, what was happening in the Philippines, what was happening in all of Asia during that period. The East, was kind of flooding into the West with all of its chaos, but also its music and its religion and its cultural fashions. And so these two men from the West were heavily influenced by these winds from the East, and so their religious search could not be separated from the political turmoil of the time. So it's an ambitious book trying to figure out how all of these social forces mixed together. And through these two men, we can maybe kind of understand what these forces were doing in the world because they kind of channeled it to us through popular culture.
Interesting. So tell us about the novel Tales from the Bayou City.
This is a novel set in Houston, Texas, in the 80s and early 90s. And in fact, a lot of it was originally written during that time period. I was living in Houston back in the 80s, um, and was trying to figure out how to write a novel, and I never could pull it off. So a lot of this material originally appeared as short stories, but I finally figured out how to organize it as a novel all these years later. And it's about migrant populations. I think it's a very current idea. Immigrants coming to Houston and then trying to find their place in the U.S. So that's kind of what it's about. It's both historical in the sense that it's 40 years ago, but it's still very topical.
Hmm. Well, congratulations on those. And what do you got coming next?
I am currently working on a biography of Cormac McCarthy.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, wow, indeed. I don't know if this is wise. It's a,
I mean,
it's
he didn't reveal a lot of himself,
He did
did
not.
he?
No, no, he did not. But and again, as with a lot of the biographies I've pursued, one of the challenges, but one of the interesting things is you want to get to people before they're gone. And a lot of people who knew Cormac have passed on. So there are not a lot of witnesses left either. But I've been able to get to a few, and it's been very, very interesting. I've traveled to all of his haunts and places where he lived, and so I'm getting a little bit of the story pieced together, and we'll see.
How far along are you? Can you tell?
I can't tell, no. And in fact, there's an archive in Texas, the Whitliff Collection, which has the papers of many, many great writers. It's a wonderful resource. They just got a whole new batch of material, like journals and letters from McCarthy, and they're processing it now. It won't be available for research for another year. So who knows what still awaits us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Tracy Daugherty, again, thank you for coming back on the program and exploring Joseph Heller Catch-22 with us. And really appreciate you taking the time, especially as here you are on the second round. So, and just to remind our listeners again, what I said at the top is that uh, Tracy Daugherty and I talked about Larry McMurtry and his biography of Larry McMurtry. That's an earlier edition of Novelist Spotlight. I'm here fumbling for that number. It's number 134, episode number 134 of the Novelist Spotlight podcast. Is the one with Larry McMurtry. Certainly encourage you to listen to that one too. Just a great discussion. Tracy, again, thank you very much.
Always good to talk to you, Mike. Thank you.